I think we'll go in order of the program, and we'll turn to Judd Devermont next, the National Intelligence Officer for Africa.
Great, thank you, Amanda. I'm going to try to build on Steve's comments, but I really want to focus us on what I think are the power dynamics that are going to change over the next decade in Africa. And there are three big trends that I want to point out. One, a diffusion of power from rulers to the ruled, a passage of power from one generation of leaders to another, and finally an expansion of power from what I'll call the heavyweights, Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa, to other countries and to regional organizations. So let me start with the diffusion of power. I expect over the next decade that African publics are going to have a greater say and influence over their country's politics. They are going to increase their participation in protests, in public action, and this is going to shape government policy and drive societal change. If you're familiar with Adam Branch and Zachary Mpele's book from last year, Africa Uprising, they call this the third wave of protests. They look at the anti-colonial protests of the 1960s, and then they look at as the first wave, and they look at the late 80s, early 90s protests, the pro-democracy protests of the second wave, and then what we've been seeing now is the third wave. But I tend to think that the wave metaphor is a little misleading because waves crest and then they crash. And I think what is different about the protests we are seeing in Africa today is that they are more sustainable and they are more likely to become part of the permanent political landscape. What we've already seen in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso, in Congo, in South Africa, I think it's significant because we're seeing advocates, activists, and the broader public, they're facing lower barriers to collective action than their predecessors have done. So in other words, the possibility for mass mobilization is much higher now and as we move towards the future. And there's really four structural factors that underpin it. Steve mentioned a little bit. I know that Howard and Amadou will also touch on them, so I'll just run through them for the purposes of my comments. And these are increased living standards, rapid urbanization, the advances in communication technology, and the demographic changes. So Steve already mentioned Africans are wealthier and healthier than they were in previous periods. I'm not going to get into the debate of how many middle-class Africans there are and whether or not they are going to be able to weather current economic downturn. But I think for the purposes of protests, there are two really important points. One, if you are wealthier and healthier, you have a greater stake in your country's political and economic direction. You have things to lose if things go south, and so maybe a little more incentive to be on the street. Secondly, you have a little more financial wherewithal. You can take a hit, leave your job for a couple of days, and go to the street if it's something that you want to fight for. The second underlying structural factor here is rapid urbanization. People may know that Africa is about 40% urban now. It's going to be more than 50% urban over the next couple of decades. But what urban dwellers tend to be are much more aware of government performance. They know if government is failing. They know if government is providing services. It's not like being in the village where government misrule is sort of distant and abstract. They can see it with their own eyes. And so I think this allows them to be much more acute observers of the political process. Also, urban dwellers have these natural organizational and spatial setups where they can organize. A densely populated urban area allows urban dwellers to forge multi-ethnic, multi-religious coalitions to press for change. They can build on organizations, whether it's your community organization or a labor union, to fight for the interests that they believe are important to them. I think paired with that really is the advances in communication technology. I think Africa now has 1 billion subscribers to mobile phones. What does that mean? Africans are more connected to themselves, and Africans are more connected to the world. They're able to disseminate information more effectively. They're able to organize more effectively. And when we look at some of the academic research, we tend to see that countries with higher mobile penetration are more susceptible to episodes of mass mobilization. And the final point is demography. We're going to talk a lot about Africa's youth bulge. I think Linda Thomas Greenfield mentioned 70% of Africans are under 25. I'm actually interested over the next decade how many Africans sort of jump over that threshold and become 25. Because when we see higher age groups, we tend to see more participation in civic activities. I mean, that's not really an African truism, that's a global truism. Youth don't participate until they start hitting into their mid-20s. I think the Fees Must Fall protest in South Africa is a good example of that. And when you take a growing over 25 population, and then you pair that with some of the research that Afrobarometer has, that African youth have less affinity or less connection or less, I would say, unwavering loyalty to an incumbent, it's a really potent mix. So these four trends give me confidence that we are going to see an increase in the number and scope of protests in Africa. Actually, we've already started to see that happen. Since 2010, before the Arab Spring, we've started to see an increase in protests in Africa. And this is really interesting. The number of protests in Africa are actually more in number than the global average. And compared to the global average, they've been more successful. 2/3 of African protests since 1940 have actually removed an incumbent, and about 10% of African protests since the 1940s have won major concessions, and that compares to 46% for the non-African global average and about 15%. The question really is going to be the uncertainty of how governments respond. So I have a lot of confidence that protests will be on the rise and we'll see more public action, but it's really going to be up to the governments how they want to respond to these protests. They can adapt, they can co-opt, they can anticipate and perhaps become more responsive and democratic, or they can be more repressive and I think really invite more political instability.